Okay, yesterday, President Obama gave what is probably going to be his last speech to the United Nations. Thank goodness, right? Well, he said a couple of things that I wanted to touch on and point out. President Obama said he was convinced that in the long run, giving up some freedom of action, in other words, national sovereignty, independence, binding ourselves, in other words, binding the United States government to international rules over the long term enhances our security. And he said, we can only realize the promise of the United Nations founders if powerful nations like our own accept constraints. What was he saying there? Well, first off, President Obama, just like President George H.W. Bush, said that the vision of the founders of the United Nations is to become a world government, to create this, like President Bush said, a new world order. And this is essentially an international oligarchy run by socialism, of course, is what it would be. And it would be a one world government. Of course, that would mean number two, Obama is for canceling, effectively, our independence that was gained back in 1776 for the War for Independence, and letting the United Nations call the shots. Also, number three, he said that we should submit to the United Nations. Now, not only do we need to get out of the United Nations to stop this, but it also becomes obvious we need to reject those who enable the United Nations within our government, who say, oh, we'll let the United Nations decide on this matter. No, we're a sovereign country, we should act that way. So, the fourth thing I would say is, if we're at a stage in our country where our political leaders act as if the United Nations is the boss, what I would call the illusion of sovereignty, inevitably that stage will be followed by a period in which the UN actually becomes our master, if this situation is left to persist. Now, this isn't just a matter of getting new political leaders who want our country to keep its independence, although that would be an improvement. But we need to get at the root of the problem. First, we need to educate people on the dangers of the United Nations, what it actually is aiming to become, and what it always, according to Obama, and we can cite probably endless quotes of the founders of the United Nations, how they secretly wanted this to grow into a world government. But we also need to remove any excuse from any politicians who might think differently, that we need to get rid of that independence that was so hard and fought for. And what we need to do to get rid of that excuse, a big thing would be to get the United Nations out of the United States, and of course to get the U.S. out of the UN. So I would urge you to contact your congressman and ask them to support House Resolution 1205, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. The second part of this is, if you do actually get to sit down with your congressman or talk with one of their aides, you might get one of several excuses. I think I listed 3. Don't accept the flimsy excuse that the USA needs to keep a veto on the United Nations Security Council. I've got news for you. China and Russia also have veto power. Plus, most of the things the UN does never come up before the Security Council anyway. So, don't buy that. Also, don't accept the excuse that the UN protects Israel. Or sometimes they'll even argue the contrary, that the U.S. needs to be in the UN to protect Israel from the United Nations, through its veto power on the Security Council. Neither one is accurate. Look, once again, many things don't come up before the Security Council. For example, the UN General Assembly. Everybody has an equal vote. All nations get one vote. Doesn't matter if it's the United States or Trinidad and Tobago or whatever. Plus, the UN General Assembly gives quasi-government status to organizations who don't really have a country, but they're like the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is kind of sort of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. I don't know if there's any other way to put that. They're a terrorist organization. They've been doing it for years, killing people, blowing up stuff. Also, the United States can protect any country it wants, with or without the UN. We have the biggest military on the planet, the most powerful military in the world. Why should we be sending money, which is 22-26%, depending how you account for it, to pay for the UN to do all of its nefarious stuff? Why should we host their headquarters in New York City? Why should we give diplomatic immunity to their ambassadors? It doesn't make sense. Now, in the end, as much as people might like to help this or that country, the U.S. government was formed, the federal government was formed to help our country first. Insisting that the U.S. government stick to that priority is not anti-anybody. It's just pro-American. Finally, don't accept the excuse that the United Nations is our way, the way that the United States can push the rest of the world around. Any congressman or congresswoman who believes this is a proper thing for our nation to do is part of the problem. And they need to be removed and replaced with someone with at least a basic grasp of what the federal government is for in the first place, before any progress can be made toward reasserting our independence and getting the United States out of the United Nations. The UN's recent episodes in pushing the world around just happen to involve raping children, killing perhaps tens of thousands of Haitians by dumping raw sewage into drinking water, and knowingly abandoning over 800,000 Tutsis in Rwanda to be slaughtered mostly by machete, hacked to death, mercilessly by their Hutu rivals, among other things. Most people understand that some things are grounds for divorce. You don't need to reform something that was founded to kill you, right? Nobody says we should reform ISIS, but the UN was formed to end our nation's independence. It was formed to kill our nation, essentially. The idea of breaking ties when there are irreconcilable differences is what our nation was founded upon. One of the principles that started our country. Now, when there's irreconcilable differences in a marriage, there's a breakup. We need to do the same thing on the international realm. Our nation was founded on this idea. The world will not end if we get out of the UN, of course. We have nearly infinite ways to communicate with other nations and resolve our differences. In fact, the United States dealt productively and had many interactions before all the technology and before the UN came into being with other nations. And we can still do that. The British got out of the European Union. What are we waiting for? How many more signs do we need? What we need to do today is call Congress 202-224-3121. 202-224-3121 and ask them to support H.R. 1205, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, to get the U.S. out of the UN, or what is sometimes called Mexit. Once again, call Congress 202-224-3121, ask them to support the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, H.R. 1205, and get us out of the UN. Thanks.